Hello, this section is entitled Creating an Autoscaled Managed Instance Group Using an Instance Template. And as you can tell, that's quite a mouthful. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into pieces. We're going to start off with an instance template. So basically, an instance template is a set of configurations you're going to create that then you can turn around and use as sort of a base for creating other actual images. So you make a lot of choices, things like machine types and whatnot. So I think the easiest way of seeing this is actually to just create one. So we go to do this, we're in our training main project, logged in, and we go to Compute Engine. Instead of VM instances, we're going to go down to instance templates. And see, you got a create instance template button. And what you'll see here is it looks a lot, if you kind of scroll through this, looks a lot like creating an instance. As a matter of fact, I compared them. The main difference here is that we don't have a choice here of creating establishing a zone or a region for this. That's because that's done somewhere else. So all we're doing here is doing everything else but the networking, essentially. So we're going to leave this replicate what we did in the last example. So we're going to leave everything alone except for we're going to allow HTTP traffic, because what we're going to do is we're going to make that Apache web server. And then we also then want to automatically, I'm going to copy and paste this startup script. And in fact, this is one of the powers in particular of using instant templates, because now we can actually kind of use this now as a starting point for building other images, and it will already have all the software we need, in this case Apache, running to make it work. So that's all we do. We're going to leave everything else alone, just like we did before, and you say create. So you can see that this created pretty quickly. That's principally because we didn't actually create any instances. So right, if you look under instances, you will notice that there is no instances. You just have this instance template, right? And that's because it's just it's kind of a settings to actually create the instances. So I think the first thing we're going to do is just illustrate that we can create instances out of this. So under VM instances, we're going to hit create this time. Now last time, we didn't really pay attention to this left side, but you can see, there's a choice here. It says create new VM instance from template. So I click on this instead, and what it's essentially doing now, I'll let you choose a template. So there's the template. I hit continue. And it basically pre-populates this form here based on the settings we did in our template, right? That's sort of the nature of a template. The only difference now is we can actually pick a region and a zone, and I just hit create, right? And I'm going to pause the video for a second, but we'll inspect this instance when it's done. So let me pause the video. Okay, we're back. So I made the mistake, or not mistake, but I called the temp instance called instance template 1, which is an odd name for an instance. But I should have probably called it instance 1, but that's an aside. So you can see that now I've got an instance, and indeed, if I click on this, I've got my web page, right? Because the template had the startup script in it. So that's all there really is about just instance templates. So let's go ahead and delete. I'm going to stop this instance here by, where is my menu? Hang on, where is my, okay, I'm getting delete. Okay, I'm going to pause the video while this deletes, and then we'll continue. Okay, we're back. So that was this kind of a artificial example of using instance templates, because they go through all the effort of creating an instance template to then turn around and only create a single copy of it doesn't make a lot of sense. So one of the tools here is called instance groups. And what this will let you do is you could actually create more than one of these at a time, sort of manage them as a unit. And let's just go through the exercise of creating one, and we'll talk through the features. So if I go to instance groups, and I push create instance group. We're going to talk about this first case here. We'll at the end of this, we'll talk about the 3 cases. So for now, we'll ignore the left side of this. So the instance group, we'll call it instance group 1, right? That's fine. Now, the first thing you need to know is that there's broadly 2 different kinds of managed instance groups. One is called a single zone, and the other one's a multiple zone. And the main distinction is a single zone means any instances that it creates will be in this one zone, whereas multiple zones allows you, it'll spread them across your multiple zones. So the principal reason why you might want to use multiple zones is for redundancy, because let's say one of the data centers goes down at Google, which essentially means one of these zones goes down. If you run your instances across multiple zones, then the other zones will hold the load. So the general idea is you're trying to provide some service and you're trying to provide it reliably. You definitely want to use multiple zones. Okay. Instance template, that's pretty clear what we're doing here, right? Now there's different modes of this, right? One's called an auto-scaling mode. One is don't auto-scale, and there's sort of an unusual case where it only auto-scales up. So essentially auto-scaling allows you to have the size of this instance group, the number of instances, be controlled by some metric. So one option is, the default option here is CPU utilization. So what would this happen is that if you had a certain number of instances running in this instance group, and all of a sudden the CPU utilization across all of them jumped up above 60%, it's going to recognize that it's going to want to create more instances. And then once it drops below 60%, it's going to try to drop down the number of instances. It's going to try to keep the CPU utilization at 60%. Now just so you know, there is the bottom here, there's a minimum and a maximum. So you can always specify the minimum number of instances you'll have and the maximum, right? So you can kind of set a floor, say maybe you want 3 copies running all the time. So that's one kind of auto-scaling based on CPU, but there are other metric types. So we'll talk about load balancing in a later video. But another one is called Stackdriver Monitoring. So, basically Stackdriver monitoring is the same thing as cloud monitoring. And you can actually observe metrics that are not directly related to your workload and trigger scale ups or scale downs based on those metrics. And I think the classic example that they talk about is you've got a worker queue, which is called pub sub, where you've got a series of jobs that need to be worked on. And maybe as the job list grows, you want to trigger more workers to start pulling work off of it. So that's an advanced case, but and we're not going to do it now. We may do it later, but for now, what we're going to do is we're going to keep it super simple, and we're not going to auto scale at all. But we do want a number fixed. Say we just want to start off with 3 instances. And again, it'll start with 3 instances, and we can scale down to 1, or we can scale up to 10. So that's essentially what we'll do in this example to keep it super simple. So we can skip that. We're not going to talk about predictive auto-scaling. That's an advanced feature. Real quickly, cooldown period. It's just basically an indicator of how long. It's kind of funny it calls cooldown. It should be like spin up period. But basically, it specifies how long it takes your app to initialize after initial boot. So in this case, our instance template has to download, do an apt update, and then it has to install Apache 2, which takes about 60 seconds. So we'll leave it at 60 seconds. So we're just telling the system how long it takes before an instance is really ready to take traffic, for example. And there's one other feature here called auto healing. We're not going to do it in this example. We may do it later. But so what this is designed to do, this instance groups, if one of those boxes, for example, or one of your instances was to crash for some reason, it would get deleted, and the instance group, in this case, if it has set it to 3, it would automatically spin up another one, and it would kind of heal itself to 3. But sometimes, your instances may fail for other reasons other than flat out crashing. So maybe it's a web server and it stops serving traffic for some reason, but the instance itself stays up and running. So what a health check does is allows you to create some process that maybe hits your web page on your instance on a regular cycle. And if ever that web page comes back with a 500 error or doesn't return at all, then the instance group will assume that instance is bad, it'll get deleted, and then the instance group itself will create a new instance. So we're not going to use health check in this example, but that's what health check's about. So I think we've talked about all the major features of a instance group, right? So let's go ahead and just create this and see what happens. So I'm going to pause the video in a second. You can see that it's spinning up here. So let me pause the video and then we'll come back to it when it's all up and running. Okay, we're back. Took a few minutes, but you can see the instance group is now up and running. And you can see it says that there's 3 instances. So as a matter of fact, if I was to go to VM instances, I can see indeed that there are 3 instances running. And you see that their names are actually based on the name of the instance group, right? Instance group with some hash value after it. And they each have their own IP address. And if I click on one of these, I should see my hello world, right? They're all basically the same. Basically, they're all based on the same template, so it's not surprising they all do the same thing. Now, later on, we'll talk about a load balancer. That's kind of outside the context of this video. But instead of having to click on 3 different IP addresses or addresses, I can actually create a single address that front ends all 3 of these. But that's more of a networking topic, and we'll cover that later. The other thing I wanted to mention, and it's more in passing, so let's go back to instance groups, is if I go back to create instance group, you notice that we kind of breezed over this. There are actually 3 sort of options here. So the one we used was the default one, which was the stateless. And the next one is called a managed group, but it says stateful. The principal difference between these two is stateless is it treats those particular VMs as essentially ephemeral, that it deletes them, there's no state left over, and when a new one comes up, it never knew about the past. Essentially, that's the word stateless. Stateful, if you have, for example, a database that you want to always maintain 3 copies of the database, but if one goes away, you want to kind of recreate, at least it needs to connect back to the same database, the files that it had. So they're stateful. That is, when a new one comes up, it needs some data from the previous one to operate properly. And so stateful is kind of an add-on feature to the stateless, where it can maintain external disks, and we'll talk about external disks too, but you can actually have disks get mapped back to it, so the database gets, and when it comes back, the second copy comes back up, it actually has the same data that the previous one did. So that's essentially what stateful is about, is maintaining state between the instances. And then the last example is really an oddball one, unmanaged instance group. And essentially here it's a very limited feature thing where you can kind of create a group of instances pretty much for the purposes of a load balancer. It doesn't do almost any features. It doesn't do auto scaling, auto healing, all the things that we talked about it basically doesn't do. It just creates a group of instances that you can later use with a load balancer, and you basically manually manage the individual instances. So it's a really maybe an edge case of using instance groups. By far the most common example of instance groups is managed and stateless. So that's all we're going to cover in this video. Oh, actually, before I do that, one thing we can do is we can delete the instance group, right? And so if I hit delete here like this, if I hit delete, what it's going to do, it's going to take down the instance group and it's going to remove out all the instances. So that's now, yeah, so that's, well, I'll push the button when I'm done, and we'll talk about the next video.